Robert Troy is far from the only landlord in Leinster House. Almost 80 TDs and Senators are landlords or landowners. Some politicians hold substantial property portfolios. Is there a potential conflict of interest here? We go now to Rory Hearne, lecturer in social policy at Maynooth University and author of the forthcoming book, Gaffs. Rory, do you have a difficulty with TDs and Senators having property portfolios?
I think it is a real issue, Shane, and I think you highlighted at the outset of the program this morning about that question of housing being treated as investment rather than as home. And I think that it is important to point out that, as you say, Robert Troy is not the only one who has extensive properties. And even in terms of, if we look at former ministers for housing, Alan Kelly, Simon Coveney were landlords while ministers. There's, as you said yourself, there's at least 80 of the TDs who have officially declared that they have properties.
TDs and Senators.
TDs and Senators, should I say? Yeah, TDs and Senators. And it's interesting in this because the SIPO standards in public office specifically cite property, and they cite material interest when members have material interest as being necessary to declare that. And why they highlight that, of course, is because it is a potential conflict of interest. When you are making policy decisions and you are deciding on what housing policies to introduce, while also benefiting from those very policies. And if we look at, for example, what government has done, successive governments over the last 10 years in particular, I have made the point over and over that they have made policies largely in favour of what we call, turning housing into an investment, in favour of landlords, in favour of investors, in favour of
like what
developers.
though? Like what, Rory, for example?
Well, for example, not capping rents. Rents.
But they have brought in rent caps, rent controls.
No, but up until the period of 2016, rents were increasing year after year. Opposition parties, myself and others, were saying we needed to cap rents. When they introduced the cap in 2016, it was only a 4%. It was a 4% cap, which meant rents could keep increasing 4% year on year. It is only in the last year or so they've introduced a 2% cap. And there has been calls for a number of years, for example, rent freezes. Why have they not frozen rents? Why have they not?
Have they not done it though, Rory? Is it not like have they not done it because these aren't straightforward issues and there are downsides to doing these things? I mean, I struggle to think that TDs are saying, I'm not going to do it now because it might cost me 20 quid a week in rent. Are they not doing it because they think actually, or because government policy is, you may disagree with it, but government policy is this is actually going to create more problems than it solves?
I think you're right. That is not the sole factor, them thinking we're making money out of this. But what I would make the case is that they are benefiting for it. And so it does influence your thinking. Of course it does. And it influences. So it is a factor, and it shouldn't be a factor. The fact that, and we know, for example, Robert Troy was making representations in the Dáil in relation to the Examiner revealed yesterday around COVID and evictions of landlords. We know also, for example, in terms of landlords benefiting from the RAS scheme, the HAP scheme, that change in policy from building social housing to relying on the private rental sector. It is, of course, not the only factor, but it is a factor. That's why.
Okay, how do we get around it, Rory? Because we can't stop people. It's a free country. If people want to buy property, that is their right. I mean, we do have a register of interest. I mean, part of the problem was Robert Troy didn't fill that in correctly. But what else can we do?
Well, I think the starting point is there has to be accountability for people who do have property interests, and that has to be declared. Yeah. And there has to be real consequences if you don't.
Well, we have had real consequences. He's lost his job, so.
Well, yeah. Well, we need to look. I think there needs to be a wider questioning now of this. Is it appropriate for elected members to hold properties, to hold multiple properties? Of course, own your family home or business or whatever it is. But in terms of owning multiple properties as landlords, I think there's a real question: is that appropriate for people who are making?
Then are we putting a bar on somebody who are we putting a bar on someone who bought a couple of houses during the Celtic Tiger, thinking it was a good investment? Are we putting a bar on them standing for election?
Well, I think we have to question: is this the way we want to treat housing? And is this the way? You said again, we have to shift away.
I agree with you. I agree with that. But I'm just wondering, do we put a? No, I agree. But do we put a blanket ban on anyone who's got property from standing for the Dáil?
I think you could put a blanket ban on anyone owning property from standing in the Dáil or being a minister. Of course you can't. But I do think there is a real issue around this conflict of interest of owning multiple properties. So maybe we need to look at clear decisions on housing policy. For example, legislation in relation to evictions, legislation in relation to rent caps. Those TDs, should they be allowed vote in that sense? Should they absent themselves?
It's an interesting idea, but then, if I'm a TD and I'm a parent, do I not vote on cutting child allowance or increasing child allowance?
Well, I think there's a difference in that and this material benefit, which SIPO specifically states in relation to materially benefiting from legislative change, that property is an area which is cited where elected members have to declare their interest, because it is a particular area where people do directly profit from. So I think that there is a particular area of housing, and we do have to look at it. And I'm not sure of whether, an outright ban or how you would work that, but I do think we need to think about this and we need to look at it. And it raises the wider question, as you said, that we need to shift away from seeing property as this investment asset, and we have to lead from the top. Politicians should not be treating property as an investment, and that is where the real anger about Robert Troy is coming from.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Dr. Rory Hearne, lecturer in social policy at Maynooth University, author of the forthcoming book, Gaffs. Thank you for talking to Newstalk Breakfast.